محمد الهادي البشير قد جاءنا حقا نذير.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. How are you? Ahlan wa sahlan. Welcome to our webinar on the real Rumi. Inshallah, we'll begin in another 10 minutes. Dr. Muhammad Isa Waley will be joining us. And so in the meantime, while we're waiting, he's prepared for us a reading of Rumi in Persian and in English. So just so we can get our feet wet with what he's going to be talking about. So I'll play that, and inshallah we can all listen to it, and we'll begin in another 10 minutes.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين. می‌فرماید جلال الدین محمد بن محمد بلخی الرومی قدس الله سره العزیز. ای طایران قدس را عشقت فزوده بالها، در حلقه سودای تو روحانیان را حلها. در لا احب الآفلین پاکیز صورتها یقین، در دیده های غیب بین هر دم ز تو تمثالها. افلاک از تو سرنگون، خاک از تو چون دریای خون. ماهت نخوانم ای فزون از ماه ها و سالها. کوه از غمت بشکافته، آن غم به دل تافته. یک قطره خون یافته از فضلت این افضلها. ای سروران با تو سند، بشمار را دان عدد. دانید را هم بود اندر تبع دنبالها. سازی خاکی سیدی، بر وی فرشته حاسدی. با نقد تو جان کاسده، با مال گشت مالها. توقع شمس آمد شفق، طغرای دولت عشق حق. فال به سال آرد سبق، کان عشق زد این فالها. از رحمتا للعالمین اقبال در پیشان ببین. چون مه منور خلقها، چون گل متعرشالها. عشق امر کل ما رقعی و قل زمو ما جرعی. اون صد دلیل آورده و ما کرده استدلالها. از عشق گردون معتلف، بی عشق اختر منخسف. از عشق گشت دال الف، بی عشق الف چون دالها. آب حیات آمد سخن، کاید ز علم من لدن. جان را از او خالی مکن، تا بردهد اعمالها. بر اهل معنی شد سخن اجمالها تفصیلها. بر اهل صورت شد سخن تفصیلها اجمالها. گر شعر را گفتند پر به بود دریاز دار. به ذوق شعر آخر شطر خوش می کشد ترحالها. From Masnavi Book 1, translation of the story, translation by Javed Mujaddali. A deaf man went to visit his sick neighbor. A partially deaf man heard someone say that his own neighbor had got sick that day. He thought, I'm deaf. What will I comprehend of the sentiments expressed by my sick friend? For he is now ill and might have lost his voice. But I'm obliged to go. I have no choice. When I see this friend's lips move, then I'll guess the sentiments he's trying to express. When I ask him, how are you, dearest friend? He'll say, all right, or I am on the mend. I'll ask, what have you had for lunch today? Some bean soup and some tonic, he will say. To your health, I'll say. To whom do you now go for treatment? He says, Dr. So-and-so. I'll say he's very talented and blessed, so everything will turn out for the best. I've seen myself his power and skillfulness. Whatever he's tried, he's met success.
He thus rehearsed such comments in his head, then went to see his sick friend in his bed. How are you? Almost dead. The Lord be praised. The sick friend grew offended and amazed, thinking, praise God, does this man want to fight? The deaf man's guesses hadn't turned out right. He asked, what have you had? A poisonous drink. He said, to health. The sick man reached the brink. The deaf man asked, which doctor's coming then to treat you so that you'll feel well again? The angel of death. So just go away. The deaf man said, rejoice, he'll save the day. The visitor left, thinking this inside. Thank God I came. He was self-satisfied. The sick man thought, he's my worst enemy. I never knew he could act spitefully. He then thought of expletives in his mind. I'll write to him swear words of every kind. When someone swallows soup that has turned bad, he soon feels ill, vomits what he's had. Suppress your rage. Don't spew it out like this. You'll be rewarded with the sweetest bliss. He had no patience, so he grew irate, saying, where are you, bastard? You just wait. I'll ram your words back down your throat again. My lion-like consciousness was sleeping then. Visiting sick men is to bring relief, not to antagonize and pile on grief. You wanted just to see your foe distressed, so that your filthy mind could find some rest. In acts of worship, many go astray with thoughts of their rewards on Judgment Day. Truly their worship's just sin in disguise, although their vileness seems pure to your eyes. The deaf man thought he'd done a righteous act, but it led to the opposite, in fact. Content, he thought, I did well, I feel thrilled, my duty to my neighbour I've fulfilled. As we've seen, the fire was made to start. He burnt himself thus in his sick friend's heart. Beware of ever kindling such a fire. The sum of all your sins will just rise higher. The prophet told pretentious men one day, repeat your prayers, you didn't truly pray. Our remedy for such pretentiousness is begging him in every prayer, guide us. Dear God, don't mix these prayers of ours today with those of show-offs who have gone astray. Due to the reasoning this deaf man applied, his 10-year friendship with his neighbor died. Your temporal reasoning's powers are unfit for revelation, which is infinite. If your ears still savor every word, this means your inner ear still has not heard. From the Divan, commitment, a matter of love and death. چه بی وفا جانی که بر ذوالوفا عاشق نشد قهر خدا باشد که بر لطف خدا عاشق نشد چون کرد بر عالم گذر سلطان ما ذاق البصر نقشی به پدید آخر که او بر نقش ها عاشق نشد جانی کجا باشد که او بر اصل جان مفتون نشد آهن کجا باشد که بر آهن ربا عاشق نشد من در این شهر دی بشنیدم از جمع پری خوانش بده بالا که او بر شهر ما عاشق نشد ای وای آن ماهی که او پیوسته بر خشکی افتاد ای وای آن مسی که او بر کیمیا عاشق نشد بسته بود راه اجل نبود خلاصش معتجل هم عیش را لایق نبود هم مرگ را عاشق نشد. How faithless is the soul that's not in love with the most faithful one. Will the wrath of God be upon the one who has not fallen for God's grace. When that monarch whose sight strayed not journeyed beyond the entire world, not being enthralled to outer form, he saw a form beyond all form. Where is there a soul that's not in love with all souls' origin? Where is the iron that's not in love with the magnetic one? Beside the city gate last night I heard a band of fairies say, find him a dwelling. God forbid that he fall in love with our town. How sad is the fate of a fish that keeps falling upon dry land. How sad the fate of copper that's not in love with the elixir. The way is blocked to his dying hour. There is no quick escape for him. He is not fit to be alive, nor has he fallen in love with death. Central theme of these lines is it's part of original sound human nature, the fitra, to feel a stronger attachment to the Creator than to anyone or anything else. It is also part of fitra nature to aspire to refine oneself by transcending one's limitations. God's faithfulness is his constant compassion and concern for his creatures, even for those who show no reverence and or who deny him. Also his generosity to those who are dutiful towards him. Those who are not strongly attached to the Lord and cherisher who provides for all their needs, says Maulana Rumi, are neither fit to be alive nor in love with death, as are those who long to meet their Lord. They are like fish out of water and looked upon with aversion by the pure-hearted, the local band of fairies. Amongst those in love with death are the people who strive to follow with the example of the Prophet, Ali Salatu Wasalam, whose sight strayed not, but who remained fixed upon Allah himself, even when he passed miraculously in his bodily frame from the confines of this lower world into the realms beyond, where he beheld a form beyond all forms. Although he alone was granted that privilege while still alive in this world, the most fortunate of believers are permitted to experience for themselves a divine attraction which magnetizes them permanently, and perhaps even a direct recognition of God, which is like an elixir that turns hearts to gold. From Treasury of Rumi. Don't sell yourself short. The value of the human being. حق الله تو را قیمت عظیم کرده است. می‌فرمایی که إن الله اشترى من المؤمنين أنفسهم وأموالهم بأن لهم جنة. تو به قیمت برای دو جهانی چه کنم قدر خود نمیدانی. مفروش خویش ارزان که تو بس گران بهایی. حق تعالی می‌فرماید که من شما را و اوقات و انفاس شما را و اموال روزگار شما را خریدم. اگر به من صرف و به من دهید بهای آن بهشت جاویدانی است. قیمت تو پیش من این است. اگر تو خود را به دوزخ فروشی ظلم بر خود کرده باشی، همچنان که آن مرد کرد کار 100 دیناری را در دیوار زد و بر او کوزه یا کدوی آویخت. Allah Most High has attached an immense price to you, saying, Allah has purchased from the believers their selves and their property, pledging that paradise shall be theirs. In value, you're beyond this world and the next. If you don't know your own worth, what can I do? Sanoi's Hadith al-Haqiqah. Don't sell yourself short. Your value is immense. Allah Most High says, I have purchased you, your every breath, your property, your lifespan. If they are spent on me and given to me, their value is eternity in paradise. That is what you are worth to me. If you sell yourself to hell, you will have wronged yourself, like the man who stuck a dagger worth 100 gold dinars in the wall, then hung a pot or gourd from it. Lastly, another short excerpt from the Masnavi, translated by Javed Mujaddi. In explanation of how everyone's movement proceeds from where he is, he sees everyone from the limited perspective of his own existence. Abu Jahl saw Muhammad once, and said, an ugly thing the Hashemites have bred. Muhammad said to him, your words are true, although there's none impertinent as you. Abu Bakr then exclaimed, my son of light, not from the east nor west, may you shine bright. Muhammad said, correct, companion. You fled this world worth less than carrion. Those present asked, pure chief of the elect, how can two opposites be both correct? I'm like a mirror God's cleaned to perfection. Indians and Turks both see here their reflection. Allahumma salli wa sallam wa barak alayhi wa ala alihi.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome. Just in time. We just finished listening to your recitation of the of Rumi. I don't speak. I don't know any Persian, but I've always wished to learn Persian just so I could read Rumi and understand him directly. And so it was, inshallah, I was envious of you as you were reading it.
You still have time to do, why not? Why not?
So let's begin, inshallah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallama ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Muhammad Isa Waley, somebody, a scholar of Rumi and of Islamic spirituality. Dr. Muhammad Isa Waley, for 45 years, he was the curator for Persian and Turkish manuscripts, initially at the British Museum and then at the British Library in London. His main research specializations are the classical verse and prose literature of Islamic spirituality in Persian, Arabic, and Turkish, and the paleography, codicology, illumination, and cataloging of Islamic manuscripts. Maybe, I'm not sure what codicology is. I'd love to find out more about that, inshallah. If you can tell us about some of your work in manuscripts as well, I would, we'll learn from that. He's written much and translated much, and particularly on Rumi. And Rumi was the topic of his PhD thesis. And among the many works that Dr. Muhammad Isa Waley has published is his recent translation of selections from the works of Rumi, a treasury of Rumi, which I encourage all of you to get a copy of. Sidi Muhammad, you've been a student of Rumi since your days at university. So what is it that attracted you to him?
Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum to everybody, everybody over there who's watching. Yani ikinci vatan olarak sayılıyorum. Güzel İstanbul'a selam söylüyorum ve İstanbullulara. I'm saying a salam Turkish for beautiful Istanbul, my second homeland, and those who live there. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salam ala khairil anbiya al mursaleen. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي امري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Excuse me, because I got a kind of cheat sheet in front of me with some things to prompt my answers, because I'm a bit old and I'm a bit slow and I don't excel in verbal communication. So if I'm looking at a piece of paper, it's not because I'm not. It's not because I've forgotten it. But it's you I'm talking, it's you I address. So what first attracted me to Rumi? If you excuse my saying so, preliminary word, to call him just Rumi shows in a way a lack of reverence due to one of the most eminent figures of all time in world spirituality. We can call some of the great poets Keats or Yeats, but that's a different category of individual. Also, the name Rumi only really became attached to Maulana Jalaluddin in recent centuries, probably due to the influence of his Indian admirers, who came to call him Maulay Rum or something similar, the master of Asia Minor, or the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire was known to the Arabs, as in the Quran, as Arum, Eastern Rome. Anyway, going back in my life story just a little bit, but I hope not too boringly or to much length. At school, I studied Latin and Greek. It was called the classics, And by the age of 16 or so, something like that, I was not getting very much out of what I was reading. Okay, we learned the language, but what is there to learn? Apart from Plato's Socratic dialogues, because Socrates became a hero and still is. Even for my teens, and I can remember being mysteriously attracted by a beautiful book my parents had, and it contained reproductions of Persian miniature paintings from a manuscript in the British Museum. And as a manuscript, as it turned out, I would later become the curator responsible for, and I did research in collaboration with an American art historian, so Hamza Karamali, for Shah Tahmasp, the Safavid ruler, one of the most famous Persian manuscripts in the world. Anyway, somehow there was a kind of lure of the East at work behind the scenes in this young person that was me. And when I met a young Iranian who was studying English, I ended up helping him with his English, you see, and in return he taught me just some of the basics of Zabani Farsi, the Persian language, beautiful Persian language. But at that stage I really didn't get very far, but I did end up deciding to study Persian and Turkish in Cambridge, Oriental Studies. Meanwhile, I started in my usual dilettante-ish fashion to read some Persian poetry in translation, what I could find.
And this gave me an entree into, of course, a very different world from those of Homer and Virgil. Poets like Hafez, Attar, and above all, Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi showed me three things at once, I think, now looking back on it. Poetic eloquence, something that moved you, and marvels of speech, wisdom, and passion. And these are things I'm still learning about. So I think that's what attracts me, and still attracts me, and there's still more to learn. But why he's important to us is a separate question that we've got coming, so I'm not going to sort of jump into that one yet, because you sent me that question as a separate one.
So can you tell us a little bit about Maulana Jalaluddin al-Rumi?
Well, the essentially story fairly well known. So it's recounted in the my treasury book and so many others. But let's talk about the things that, in my view, make him so important and tie them just fleetingly to his life story rather than rehearsing the whole thing. So number one, I'm saying he's a refugee. He came from what must have seemed to people at the time like the end of the world as everybody knew it. The structure of Central Asia, it's huge. Great ancient cities in their hinterlands like Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, Balkh, Herat, Tuz, Nishapur, each with their rich cultural histories going from beyond, before Islam in most cases, compared with which London or Paris at the time were more or less little towns, no great importance. Muslim historians couldn't find words to describe the kind of devastation that the Mughal invasion brought. Massacres of citizens, huge numbers, the ruining of the irrigation systems that sustained its agriculture, which never recover up to the present day. Khwarezm, to the south of the Aral Sea, now seems somewhere remote, desolate. Maybe some of us haven't even heard of Khwarezm, but it was home to such giants as the mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, from whom the algorithm is named, the polymath, great scholar Abu Rayhan Biruni, and the great Sufi Sheikh Najmuddin Qurba of Khiva. And this is the milieu that Jalaluddin came from. Indeed, in Central Asian Afghanistan, he's usually called Maulana Jalaluddin Muhammad Balkhi, the man from Balkh, rarely as Rumi. But anyway, he was compelled by Providence to leave that region and to settle in what he would have thought of as fairly much the extreme west. Of course, they were aware of the Maghreb existing as well, but it was the west of the, the known territory of Islam as most people in that part knew it. What happened was something extraordinary, and it takes us to the next part of what he was. But a refugee is somebody who's been uprooted from everything that was familiar and put into something completely different. And in the sense, we, people of modern times, have been uprooted from a time which, with all its faults, had roots in ways of life, wisdom, understandings of the world that went back for centuries and centuries, being put into a world where, in a sense, there's almost complete disjunction. And alhamdulillah, it's thanks to surviving traditions and those who uphold and express it, like Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi and the representatives of the Islamic tradition in modern times, that we still have that link. We haven't been cut off, alhamdulillah, and through Allah's mercy, we won't ever be cut off. However, so he's an ambassador from a different time, a different place, a different world in a sense, and somebody who translates him in today's street language, more or less, or something like it, has not really done justice to that, to that fact. He's an ambassador from a different world, and he brings us into that world, and he brings it alive in our minds and our hearts. Secondly, he's a scholar, he's an alim. Jalaluddin's father, Bahaddin Waled, and his family arrived after lengthy travels in Asia Minor, Anadolu, today's Turkey, which was partly under Muslim rule, but still had in many regions indigenous, a large Greek population. And in the Seljuk capital, Konya, Jalaluddin followed his father as a professor of Islamic sciences, also as a man of the Sufi path and a respected authority. Please excuse the train noise. I'm living close to a train line, railroad track as they call it here. I hope there won't be too many more. Jalaluddin gave discourses tinged with Sufism to audiences that comprised not only his own students, but also some of the most prominent figures in public life in Konya. After his father's death, he received further training on the spiritual path, which was a result of his father's wasiyah, his will. His friend Burhanuddin Muhammad came from Tirmiz on the border of today in Uzbekistan, the border from Afghanistan, to teach him and instruct him. He also did periods of study in Damascus and Halab, and we also know that he did a real mujahada. You know, he became a major zahid. He went to undergo all kinds of physical privations. So the story is quite a deep and complex one. There's so many sides to this man. As we've already seen, he sought tasawwuf along with the other sciences at a high degree of knowledge. And also he began poetry. Well, I think that's enough to say about that stage. We have his discourses from early period. Different from the ones that we know as Discourses of Rumi. I've done a translation of this and hope they'll get published. It's under the title, Arabic title, semi-Arabic title, Majalis Sabah, the 7 assemblies, 7 gatherings. And
these are works in Sufism, these are tasawwuf works? Discourse?
They're Iman, sort of what my Sheikh, Senior Sheikh Abdul Qadir Isa radiallahu anhu used to call them, Majalis Imaniya, Nurani and something. So they have some Sufism in them, and as we have them, we have lots of quotations to Sufi poets, which some of that, I think maybe, you see these ones, there wasn't anybody there with a tape recorder, you understand, or any recording device. There were people who wrote down notes. And I think these ones, at least, and perhaps the Fihi Ma'afihi ones, the discourses as well, in some cases were sort of reconstructed from notes, and it's also embellished by Maulana's son, Sultan Valad, who we know was responsible partly for editing his works, mostly after his lifetime, but then maybe sort of helped him during his lifetime as well. So let's get on to the next stage. What is he else? He's a lyric poet, passionate lover of Allah. His encounter in 1244 with the wandering ascetic called Shamsuddin Tabrizi is a transformative experience for him, his being and his life and his spiritual journey. Shams showed Jalaluddin the whole realms of knowledge and experience that had been closed to him up to that point. So he had some tasawwuf, but he hadn't, he had other places to go to. So each found in the other's company is extraordinary thing, and then each other's guidance adored to the new spiritual realizations. So Jalaluddin no longer cared about what his disciples thought about him. You know, what's this outsider doing this? He's a Malamati, right? Shams Tabrizi. What's this scruffy man doing here? And why does Maulana get distracted by this rather rude and boorish person? But the radiance of Shams's presence seemed at times hardly separable from the radiance of Allah himself. He is a mazhar, you know, is a place of in which some divine attribute is manifested, which is of course not saying anybody is divine, astaghfirullah, na'udhu billah, but everything in existence manifests Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There isn't anything that isn't a manifestation of the creative power and the actions of and the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, without which nothing would ever exist. And without the madad, imdad from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, everything would instantly cease to exist. But the mazahir are different. Some are mazahir of beauty and some are mazahir of majesty, and etc., etc. Everything manifests something. So the comparison that I make, and Allah knows best whether there's any validity in this, had not the Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam suffered inexpressible sorrow for the loss of his son Yusuf, a peerless reflection of divine beauty. For over a year, Jalaluddin and Shams were almost constantly together. Sayyidina Yaqub alayhi salam, he's a Nabi. He doesn't make mistakes about things. He's not an idolater, but his grieving over Sayyidina Yusuf is something that is emphasized very, very strong in the Quran Azim, right? Why? Why? What's this about, really? SubhanAllah.
many of those who venerated Jalaluddin, they couldn't understand what had happened. And then one day Shams suddenly vanishes, leaving because the disciples have become so jealous and they start to badmouth him, Shams. And Jalaluddin was distraught, as we can see from the poems that he wrote and other sources, and he pleaded with his friends to return. Eventually, Sultan Walid, his son, was sent to find Shams and found him in Damascus, brought him back to Konya. But it wasn't to last, because finally disappears for good this time, never to be seen again. As a spiritual master, I'm saying Maulana knew that everything that is worth loving is to be found perfection in our divine beloved, subhanahu wa ta'ala. Shams had demanded of him everything he had, so that he would transcend the bounds of conventional piety, just the taqlid, in the quest for complete experiential vision and illuminations and ma'rifah. And what he mourned was the loss of that overwhelming inner sunlight, the light of the sun, and the companion who had completed his spiritual direction continually inspired him. And the poems in Divan mention Shams Tabrizi so many times, it became popularly known as Divan Shams Tabrizi, though the early manuscripts, which I studied for my thesis, it's most often described as Divan-i Kabir, the great Divan. Understandably so, because so many thousands of baits of poetry. It's 20 to 30,000 baits, depending on your view of what's authentic. It's vast. So there's a vast treasury. So that's him as a lyric poet. Number 4, he's a murshid, as a spiritual guide, a giver of inspiring discourses and classes, and a master of didactic poetry as well as lyric. Okay, didactic poetry that imparts a message. Didacticism is not confined to the divan. We find to the Masnavi. We find in some of the ghazals in divan entirely or partly didactic in intent. Not hard and fast division there. The last years of his life devoted partly to guiding his disciples, though that was also he had deputies who dealt with some of that, and partly, perhaps mainly, to the composition of his greatest work, the Masnavi. I don't think he'd seen it coming, but then he perceived this inspiration and imposed himself on the duty to complete this kind of encyclopedia, or whatever you want to call it, summation of aspects of Islamic spirituality. You can't say it's just tasawwuf, because in just tasawwuf, it's all kinds of things of ta'lim, of akhlaq, and storytelling, entertainment, not least. And it's all to be found in this vast resource. As time passed, the impact of his loss of Shams waned then, and as we said, everything that's worth loving you find in Allah Ta'ala. But he found whatever Shams had meant to him, he found it in himself and in his saintly close companions like Hussam ad-Din Chalabi, who was a faithful, capable helper for a long time, eventually successor to his teacher, and it was also very important, the chief inspiration of his masterpiece. The Masnavi gets mentioned several times at the beginning of the daftar of a new volume of Masnavi. And so with his equilibrium restored, so to speak, Maulana lived on for another 20 years, supervising the training of disciples and continuing to teach. And it's said by Sepah Salah, his biographer, that he actually passed away, radiallahu anhu, while he was giving a lesson. Last but not least is number 5. Maulana Rumi is a teacher, sage, and poet for our times and for all times. For the world of Islam, yeah, but for the whole world. From the Middle Ages to the present day and beyond, timeless message. Perhaps you could sum it up by saying what makes him very special is the breadth, the profundity, and the wisdom and the power of expression of his teaching in prose, most especially in verse, which is combined with all his erudition and his ability to inspire, instruct, and as I said, entertain. He's fun to read. It's never boring. It's never a long lecture about this and that. If anything, you're going to be puzzled. Why has he broken off this story to tell us the moral? Why has he broken off the moral to resume his story? I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. Think about the Quran Azim. This isn't the Quran. I mean, nothing resembles the Quran except in some very, very, very limited respect. In that very limited respect, the great Abdul Rahman Jami, metaphysician and poet, said this is the Quran in the Persian language. It's a mubalagha, it's a hyperbole, right?
and maybe you should think otherwise. But the Quran goes from a narrative into an injunction, into an exclamation, into a general hikmah, into more narrative and iltifat, changing from addressing with one voice to addressing with another, and so on. All this kind of flow from one point of view to another point of view, and this is something that Masnavi has a certain aspect of this which helps to understand why it works. You don't get bored. You keep people going. He said in his discourses somewhere, and it's repeated by Allah, by Allah, what have I got to do with poetry? I just make poetry. But where I came from in Central Asia, what people wanted and what people got was wa'z. They got sermons. That's long sermons. Or in some cases like Abdullah Ansari, sort of shorter ones, a bit like the ones in the Majalis Sabah I was referring to earlier. But anyway, that was what they wanted. Here in Anadolu, in Asia Minor, people don't like that kind of thing. They want dancing and singing, they want poems. And so I provide that for them to make them happy, like a host who cooks a tripe, iskembe they call it in Turkish, for his guests because they like it, although it might repel him slightly. Because we have to take this with a pinch of salt. So to become a poet, it was a craft, and you had to study with the works of the greats before you. Everybody did that. And Maulana, genius though he was, couldn't have done without his great predecessors, some of which he praises for saying, I couldn't have been this without them. And in fact, they were greater than me. He says about Attar and Sanoin, the way he praises them, implying he was somebody even better than me. So, Muhammad, he does this because this is what people want. But actually, he shows a mastery of poetic form very often. The poems aren't even in quality, and he says about himself, again, in discourses, he says, this poetry of mine is like Egyptian bread. The night passes of it, and you can no longer eat it. It's gone stale, it's gone edible, but it's proved not to be the case, because here we are nearly 800 years later, and we're still enjoying it. It hasn't gone off at all, even when it's been transfused into a different language. We still find it edible, mashallah, alhamdulillah. So to continue, I said inspiring, instructing, and entertaining. I've said more about this in the introduction to the Treasury book, and so have more people more learned than me. If I was speaking to an audience of non-Muslims, and this book I emphasize is intended as much for non-Muslims as for Muslims, and it's not a learned treatise, and I don't go into details about this, that, and the other, and somebody like me isn't smart or knowledgeable enough to go into every detail about the theological questions and so on. My treatment is superficial, like me. But I would add that his message, much of his message, transcends all the differences of doctrine, outlook between the different races, the different types, and different creeds of Bani Adam, making Jalaluddin, he's the Jalaluddin, not only the Jal or majesty of the Deen of Islam, but the Jalal of the Deen generally, of all religious faith, and the Jamal or beauty of the spiritual world, which is, or which should be, the focus of anyone anywhere who understands the meaning, the ma'na, the meaning, masnavi and ma'navi, the masnavi with meaning. The whole point of being a human being. Human being is a true and loving, knowing servant of the Creator. Allah Ta'ala knows best. So that's some of the things that I think about Maulana.
So, so you mentioned that one of the things you mentioned, you said that he was a refugee, and all of us are refugees. And so what I understood from that was that we are foreigners in this world, and his poetry, or in his teachings, he expresses that foreignness by longing for something that is beyond, something beyond. Is that the meaning that you were expressing? And was that what caught your eye when you were?
You hit a very important nail on the head there. Very important head, because what's the first thing in the Masnavi and what's the first thing in the Treasury book? Back to our origins. I'm not going to read it all, but just the first few lines. Listen to this, read how it tells its story, complaining of the partings it has suffered, Ever since I was first cut from the reed bed, men and women have moaned with my lamenting. I need a bosom rent by parting's sorrow in order to express the pain of longing. For anyone left far away from his source misses the days when he was at one with it. So it just chimes exactly what you said.
You mentioned, Sidi, that his poetry is didactic poetry. So does that mean that does it have the, not being able to read the Persian, does it have the strength and power, the emotional power of that a poet evokes, or is it purely didactic? And for what does it sound like in the? I mean, we heard you recite it, but
it interweaves. He doesn't give you a long. He doesn't give you a long period of instruction or moralizing at one go. He moves from one thing to the other, and he maintains a kind of a momentum in a subtle kind of way. It's a piece of craftsmanship. Whatever he's saying, what other people say about the spontaneity behind it all, there's a spontaneity and there's a control, whether it's his own control or some divine kind of level of inspiration that is helping him through that, which is something he himself firmly believed in. If you read the introduction, for example, to the first Daftar, the Master Vida, which is, I think it's all in Arabic, isn't it? Practically all in Arabic. So that'll give you some idea about what he says about the level of inspiration in it. So it's not that it's either didactic or lyrically powerful, can be both at the same time, because he'll tell you something, then he'll turn to you, well, what do you make of that? Imam Ghazali, even who I've been absorbed in him for the whole, the last 5 hours or so in studying Kitab al-Tafakkur with Sheikh Yahya and Ustad Amjad here in Maqasid, alhamdulillah. Okay, so he himself turns to, in the middle of instructing you, to say, what a strange creature you are. For example, we're not talking about Imam Ghazali, but it's interesting, okay, right? So don't let me digress too long. It says, you see a painting on the wall, and it looks almost like a real person. So you admire the creativity, the finesse, and the refinement and the execution of the artist. But you look at this world around you, it's the craftsmanship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from beginning to end. And you don't wonder, the one who created this, the one who took the sperm drop and turned you into a human being stage by stage, gave you your senses, your limbs, your senses, your insight, your heart and your spiritual side, inspired this, and knew what was a tiny little drop in a piece of blood, and so on and so on, as described in the Quran. What a strange creature you are, that you like that. So Maulana Rumi, in a sense, does something a bit like that too. See?
Yeah, in the read, and I guess with the passage that you read, so everybody hears the read, but he hears something different in it, and the lament too. How would you? I was just trying to imagine Maulana Rumi as a person. So he was a scholar of the outward sciences, and then there was this visiting malamity. We described somebody who outwardly didn't wear the garb, probably, of a religious scholar, whom he was attracted to, and then he loved him, he longed for him, and he wrote his poetry, and he entertained people. He was sensitive to the needs of people. So how would you imagine him as a person? I mean, is he he's a great spiritual master, speaks about all of these meanings, but I see him as somebody who felt love, somebody who spoke to people, somebody who jokes with them, somebody who what would you?
Yes, I mean, in his biographies, we read about a man who would take an afternoon off and go with his disciples to an orchard. There's this place outside Konya, which people, Meram, and it's probably joined on to Konya by now. But you know that you could get on a bus and you'd actually be almost out of town. And they used to go there and described how he would speak to them, or maybe they'd have a little picnic, and they would have a snooze. And then,
You know, they would just hang out and have these spiritual gatherings. So the spiritual masters, before I forget to say this, they have a jalal about them, and they have a jamal about them. And in some masters, or awliya also, what you actually see in their outward persona is generally the jalal more, and what they have inside is more jamal, or the other way around, or alternating between them both. This is kind of manifestations that we see in the spiritual masters and the awliya, alhamdulillah. So he had both of these, but in what people perceive in him, and everybody has their own perception, is that the Jamal, despite his name, is what predominates.
Yeah.
Inside, Allah Ta'ala knows there's a man of tremendous spiritual amplitude. So another point of view is, don't separate Jamal from the Jalali. His being the all-vanquishing is part of his beautiful attributes as well. Because if this world didn't have death in it, suffering, we'd be stuck here forever. And this place is the prison for the believer. On the other hand, if we had it easy all the time, yeah, subhanAllah, how feeble creatures we would be. So he mixes one thing with the other in what he shows us. Some of us can handle the Jalal better than others. Some can handle the Jamal better than others. People in our times are looking for beauty, for mercy, for softness. They want somebody who listens. They want somebody who empathizes. They don't want the man who says, how are you doing today? Well, I'm dying, actually. Wonderful news, wonderful news. And all the other things that you, but I believe that was in the story from the Masnavi that I read in that really nice translation by Jawad Mujaddidi. People want to see some Jamal, right? There's a lot of Jalal around us. That doesn't mean, however, that we want a version that is, I don't know whether you're going to ask me about this side of things, a version that is a kind of filtration and not a real proper presentation of who Maulana Jalaluddin is. Have we got time for that? Or
please tell us about that, and then maybe perhaps some droplets from the ocean of his.
Very good. All right.
Identity.
So your question was, in what ways has his message been distorted in modern Western interpretations? Let's be clear, first of all, that the work of people like Colman Barks, the most famous one, the professor of literature and quite a good poet in English, has performed a very valuable function in making the name of Maulana Rumi so famous. I call his translations filtrations because almost everything he writes in the name of Rumi has been passed through a kind of ideological, theological filter to take out the Islam and any other sort of troublesome, not so digestible, not so Jamali bits, okay? An example of the worst kind of distortion is when we're blind suddenly became blonde, as I discussed in my Islamic article. These aspects of what I call Barksism were first dissected by Ibrahim Gamard, G-A-M-A-R-D, who's an American student of the Afghan scholar Rawan Farhadi, rahimahullah. Ibrahim has a good but little known book about Maulana's teachings, as well as a website called Dar Masnavi, both of which I recommend. And he's the major sort of deconstructor of Barksism, I think, along with Franklin Lewis, a friend of mine, author of the most important overall study of Rumi and the Rumi phenomenon. And in 2017, the New Yorker published an article by Omid Safi called The Erasure of Islam from the Poetry of Rumi, which seems, they say, to have gained some traction, especially among Muslims, but maybe elsewhere. So this Rumi spin-offs, so to speak, include appropriately modern adaptations of the Sama, of what became famous, the whirling dervishes, a topic I'd rather not go into too much because it's rather a red herring. Also because the Maulavi, Mevlevi Sama did not become formalized until later, when it eventually became a kind of manifestation of high Ottoman culture with all kinds of musical instruments and such like. There are new ages who give it a whirl themselves, again, according to their own interpretations and with attractive labels like Sufi dancing. The personal development guru Deepak Chopra and his acolytes
some of them very famous names, who credited Jalaluddin with the power to inspire them to new heights of success and self-fulfillment. This isn't just something to be sneered at, although it sounds so pretentious, since it seems to indicate that even the third-hand knowledge, the third-rate knowledge of Maulana can make people happier. Amazingly, even my friends at the Islamic Foundation in England have published a Rumi coloring book for adults. I was able to persuade them to present the text as inspired by Rumi rather than as genuine sound bites from the master himself and so on. But if I went any longer, you might begin to Rumi. So we'll finish our ruminations there on that subject. On the positive side, beside the contributions from those Cambridge Orientalists, Nicholson, the author of the utterly misleading selected poems of Divan Shams Tabrizi, but subsequently pioneering editor and translation of the entire Masnavi, and Arbery, we have now some very readable versions in English of various books from Masnavi by Javed Mujaddadi, who I've already mentioned, and his teacher Alan Williams, and some notable surveys and critical studies by scholars like William Chittick, Anna Maria Schimmel on poetics, Alessandro Bausani and Fatima Keshar-Vars, America. And so, alhamdulillah, things have improved. Though, as I said to Alan Williams once, you and I are the people who put the later into translator, so it takes a while to produce a good result. Javed Mujaddadi is well on his way to completing, inshallah, the whole of the 6 books. So if you like a rhyming version that takes some liberties, but is very cleverly done and learned and very readable, there you are. There's a list of recommended readings at the back of the Treasury book as well.
And maybe you can you share some of his poetry with us?
Yes, I haven't had time to come up with any new translations. I only had the sort of 2-3 hours to prepare for this interview. We set this up quite late on, so you have to excuse any infelicities and so on. But let's here's something from the actual Rumi book. Can I read the Persian first of this one, or how much time we got left, Sidney?
We can another maybe. So it depends on how much time you have. So we're scheduled for another 5 minutes, but we can keep going.
I got up to 10, and I just said this because you had some before, so before I started, so it didn't take too much. Okay, this is Commitment, a Matter of Love and Death. چه بی وفا جانی که بر دل وفا عاشق نشد، قهر خدا باشد که بر لطف خدا عاشق نشد. چون کرب عالم گذر سلطان مزاق البصر، نقشی بدید آخر که او بر نقش عاشق نشد. جانی کجا باشد که او بر اصل جان مفتون نشد. آهن کجا باشد که بر آهن ربا عاشق نشد. من بر در این شهر دی بشنیدم از جمع پری، خانش بده بادا که او بر شهر ما عاشق نشد. ای وای آن ماهی که او پیوسته بر خشکی فتد، ای وای آن مسی که او بر کیمیا عاشق نشد. I just realized I read you this one, so I'll just go through the last 2 lines, and please forgive me some unforgiveness. بسته بود راه اجل نبود خالص معتجل، هم عیش را لایق نبود هم مرگ را عاشق نشد. Just to give you the first and the last line to remind you, and please forgive my faultlessness. How faithful is the soul that's not in love with the most faithful one. The wrath of God be upon the one who has not fallen for God's grace. And then at the end, how sad is the fate of a fish that keeps falling on dry land. How sad the fate of copper that is not in love with the elixir that turns it to gold. The way is blocked to his dying hour. There's no quick escape for him. He is not fit to be alive, nor has he fallen in love with death. So there's a very kind of, quite Jalali kind of assessment of somebody who, it's a bit like what I was saying about Imam Ghazali says, what a strange creature you are. You admire all this handiwork of a human artist, and you then understand the whole of creation of Allah Tabarak Ta'ala. So going to something that I didn't read before, this is existence.
Is he saying in that at the end that if you love Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you love to die and to meet him? Is that the thrust of the end, the last?
Indeed. How can you not want to look forward to meeting the one you love? on anything in this dunya. Existence is one. We are like flutes, and the music in us is from you. We are like mountains, and the echo in us is from you, capital Y. We are like chess pieces caught up in victory or defeat. Both come from you, whose attributes shine with beauty. Who are we, O you who are the soul of our souls, that we should continue to exist beside you? We and our existences are really non-existences. You're the absolute being who manifests the transient. We are all lions, but lions on a banner. Because of the wind, they go rushing onward from moment to moment. Their onrush is visible. The wind is unseen. May the unseen thing not become absent from us. Both the wind that moves us and our being are granted by you. Our whole existence comes from you, bringing us into being. That's a nice message to end up with, perhaps. Reminder. It sort of complements the beginning part about us being in exile here in this world, which you astutely pointed to.
So there were there's one or two questions. Would you like to take them, or?
Well, I don't find myself I'm very good with questions. I say not much for a speaker, but let's let me click and see. Recommending resources. Well, yeah, for those who can also speak Persian, I think perhaps I better send some suggestions to Sheikh Hamza to send on rather than doing this in real time. But yeah, there are things in Persian. If you can get hold of Persian books, of course, which if you're in Istanbul, may not be so difficult. If you're in Iran, but in some places, unless you can get to an academic library, not so easy. But if you want to study the works of Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, where does one begin? One begins with the works of Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, which you can find online on websites as well. So don't think that you need necessarily to have some high authority before you can even start reading them, because you can say studying the works, but we just say just reading the works. So I don't want to sort of create a barrier and saying you've got to come to the, to the gurus of the subject before you can start reading, because he never said you need to have commentaries and so on. There were commentaries, there are commentaries, and there are books about him, but in many respects, and this is part of the beauty of Maulana Rumi, he doesn't require commentaries necessarily. Is an enrichment to read the commentaries, but you get plenty out of just reading the books. The more so if you know Farsi, Dari, Tajiki, whatever you want to call it. Some argue that the fact that Mevlevi tariqas have barely survived to this day in an authentic way is a sign of lack of tawfiq. Why do you think Rumi's tariq has not survived in a form beyond commercial whirling dervishes? I wouldn't say that they're all commercial whirling dervishes. I don't want to tar everybody with the same brush, but generally speaking, the performances of these things are done by people in a folkloric kind of sense. People who are interested in folklore and in artistic performances doesn't mean they're necessarily completely divorced from a spiritual perspective, you see. Without wanting to glorify all forms of showbiz, you can say that a lot of people who are artistically minded also can be people who are spiritually minded, and that there is something behind what outward expressions of artistic things or the thing that is something that's inward, that the person doing it isn't even conscious of. But the lack of tawfiq is many of the tariqas haven't lasted till the present day, and the sign of a lack of tawfiq for what? For human beings? No, Allah Ta'ala has caused certain turuq to have a very special extra degree of tawfiq, and the Naqshbandiya tariqa being one of them. So that in Turkey there's an enormous number of Naqshis, and still is, but that's not a sign there's anything wrong with the other ones. But the Khajagan and the Naqshbandiya had a special success, not only there, but also in Central Asia. For example, I talked about Najmuddin Kubra, and the Kubra Tariqa became eclipsed from about the
the later 14th and the 15th centuries Miladi, began really lost ground, so to speak. And there were actual, it's not unknown to be anti-Tariqa rivalries in the old days as well. Can you consider at the Mughal court, sometimes there were representatives of different Sufi Turk were there at the court and trying to bend the His Majesty's ear in one direction or another. Do we know anything about how Rumi, Maulana Jalaluddin Qaddasallahu Sirruhu, who trained his disciples? What was his method? I'm not an expert about this, but we don't know enough to be able to differentiate between what he himself did with his people and when the tariqah became more formalized and institutionalized. I'm not using that in a wholly pejorative sense, because if something doesn't become institutionalized partly, it's not so long likely to last so long. So some of these things, we know that the Mevlid is typically initiate at some stage was serving 1,000 days in the kitchen. So this was part of the thing, because you're training the nafs, and people are going to tell if you can't, if your cooking doesn't come out right, there's something wrong inside as well, because it's part of the secret about the art of cookery, as in other arts. Okay, so what else was his method? We really don't know much about it, but we can perhaps deduce some things, extrapolate some things from his teachings. And I don't think there's time to go into details. So I will see if there's anything further I can say to Shah, who's a friend of mine, when I've had a bit of time to think about it. How was Maulana at home as a family man? I can't answer from him as a father or a husband, except that his son Sultan Walid was devoted to him. Another son, Allah ad-Din, the relationship was a difficult one. So he doesn't say very much about parental duties or something like that, because he's not a teacher of those kinds of things, but he teaches rahmah towards everybody. And I can't think of, I don't know the work well enough to be able to quote something directly bearing on the subject, but just on the subject of child rearing, of course, like everybody else, he says that not harshness, but speaking, being firm with children is part of the way and part of the actual mercy, just as Allah's harshness with us is meant to make us correct our ways, so it's out of mercy. Is the Evrad Mevlana traceable to Mevlana Rumi? I don't believe so, but that doesn't necessarily mean none of it's authentic. It's a question I don't know enough to be able to give a firm answer on it. What are your thoughts about how Rumi is being embraced in the West? I think I've spoken about that. Do you think that speaks to his universal message, or there's a level of denouement by taking it? Well, denouement actually means to sort of being faced with the naked truth about something. So not quite sure about the question there, but the fact that he has been embraced in the West, yes. I mean, the fact that some of the things are distorted doesn't mean that he doesn't have universal messages. I've been trying to, an idea of being trying to express. Didn't get much first part of this dars. Well, there's not really a dars, so I'm not that much of an expert. Could we have a transcript? I think it would be full of ums and ahs. A transcript of an interview embarrasses interviewees. So I'd rather not give that, but I'm glad you got something out of it. Perhaps somebody who's more articulate than me. I think you can find talks about Maulana from Professor Omid Safi, who is now at Duke University, I think. But anyway, there are YouTube videos of him speaking on the subject, and I think you can find something from Dr. Omar Abdullah as well, which would be very well worth listening to. And there may be others, name escape me at the moment. So if you want something more authoritative, better go to a book or a video that's more informative than what I've been able to give you this evening. Sorry.
The more you answer, the more they come. So so I know yes, you have another point.
It's a bit difficult. Where does Rumi belong? Let's leave this the last one. Where does he believe belong as a mujtahid imam? Generally, Salafi equals practical. I don't think Salafi and practical are at all the same thing. Sunni theoretical, Falsafi philosophical. I don't agree with any of those classifications. So the wonderful thing about Maulana like Ghazali, Untitled Islam, like Sheikh al-Akbar, Ibn Arabi, they transcend categories. In the case of Ibn Arabi, he was a mujtahid imam in fiqh, but that's another matter. It's not what we're talking about. So our vast teachers who teach recitation of poems of Rumi, they have them in Iran. I don't know if there are any expats in America or elsewhere. I'm afraid that's not a question that I don't answer. So they didn't use the name in their devotional practices, Maulana's time. So I can't summarize his teachings in one sentence or principle. I'm not smart enough to do that. We haven't got enough time for such a long sentence, but please forgive me for not being able to answer everything, for any shortcomings in my knowledge or the way I've expressed it. It's been a wonderful privilege and çok memnun oldum. I've really enjoyed it so much. Thank you very much, Sheikh Hamza, for giving me the opportunity. And Allah Ta'ala, I ask that He give the Basira and everybody who's here every success in everything that's pleasing to Him, and the increases in understanding and in taqwa. And this is and in sincerity. This is something we can't do for ourselves, and Allah to give it, and He is the most generous one. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. So, Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for attending. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
صل وسلم ربي